Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I thought today would be a really good day to revisit my friend Mr. Beat on his channel, because as I look, last night he's at 999,000 subscribers, and at the rate that he adds new subscribers, I'm thinking today is the day that he hits 1 million. In fact, if you want to help, if you haven't already subscribed to his channel, the link is in the description to the original content. Let's get over there and push him over 1 million today. I couldn't be happier for him. He works hard. He loves this country. He loves history. He and I see the world very differently, but that doesn't matter because we both want the same thing. We both want to educate people about history. We both want to see America succeed. We both want to see what's best for everyone. So congratulations in advance, Matt, on 1 million subscribers. Richly deserved. And here's to the next 1 million. We're going to take a look today at his video on top 10 presidential candidates in American history that did not become president. Thought that one might be kind of interesting to check out. So let's go ahead and dive in.
I'm Mr. Beat. Have you ever run for president and lost? If so, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thousands of Americans lost the 2020 American presidential election. Like this dude, and this gal, and this dude, and this gal, and this dude, and even this dude. It's not easy running for president. First of all, it takes a lot of money. The 2020 presidential election was the most expensive yet.
And let's face it, the most qualified candidates rarely are the ones who end up winning, because there are so many factors that go into it about who you know and about your ability to raise money and all this other stuff and your connections that very rarely. I mean, look at this year. Can anyone honestly say that out of over 330 million people in the United States, that the two that we're choosing between are our best choices? Not even close.
Cost almost $6 billion, more than double the 2016 election. It also takes a lot of time. 1,194 days was technically the length of the 2020 American presidential election season from when the first opposing candidate, Representative John Delaney of Maryland, declared his candidacy on July 28th, 2017, all the way to Election Day. I still don't get why John Delaney lost. Anyway, Delaney broke the record for the earliest official presidential candidacy in American history. Many countries actually have laws limiting how long political campaigns can be, like in Japan, where it's only 12 days. Yes, most folks agree that the American presidential election season is way too long, which
100%. Boy, I'd be all for that. I imagine if you could put some kind of rules in place about that and limit the time and the money that got spent. Oh my gosh, that'd be wonderful.
By the time election day actually arrives, most of us are just so darn sick of the election and ready for it to be over.
100%.
But that's a topic for another video. In this video, we're going to focus on those losers, or those losing candidates. While there have been 40...
We can go ahead and say loser when it comes to George Wallace, though. Though I will say he did have a change of heart in his life toward the end.
5 different individuals who have served as president in American history. There have been tens of thousands of people who have run for president. And yes, most of them stood little chance of winning. Approximately 55 of them were actual contenders, meaning it appeared they had at least a solid chance of winning going into the final weeks of their campaigns. And of those 55 candidates, here are my favorites. That's right. It's another countdown video. Woot woot. So here are my top 10 failed presidential candidates. If these candidates actually were elected president, I think we would have been better off. I think our country would have gone in a better direction.
So, being completely honest, and I think Matt would say the same thing, there's no way we can know that for sure, obviously. There's no way we can know what choices someone would have made and how what their platform might have changed. Because look at how many candidates had a platform, had something that they ran on very heavily, and then they get into office, and all of that gets derailed because of events that happen. George W. Bush with 9/11, Lincoln with the American Civil War. completely changes the trajectory of their presidency. And of course, all of this is completely subjective as well. It's our opinion. One person's opinion of what they think would make a good president might not be someone else's.
Criteria for qualified candidates is simple. Number 1, they had to be a major contender. Number 2, they had to run before the year 2000. Number 3, they couldn't later win the presidency.
So I like that he's putting that cutoff date in. That's probably a good idea.
For example, Andrew Jackson lost the election of 1824, but then later won in 1828. Now, how I picked these top 10 is also simple. I looked at, number 1, character. They had to be a good person. Number 2, leadership experience. And number 3, their platform.
And so this is a great example of where the subjectivity of it all comes in. Some people would say, I don't care about their character. As long as I think they could do a good job, I couldn't care less about what kind of a person they are. For other people, that's a really important factor. And none of us are really in the place where we can judge what criteria someone else uses to vote. Some people are one-issue voters. Whatever that one particular issue is for them, that's what's most important in how they vote. And that's fine. Everybody can make their own choices about what matters to them.
I hopefully agreed with most of their platform. Remember, most presidents in American history actually stayed true to their campaign promises after they got elected, and I would assume that these candidates would as well.
Stayed true to it, but not necessarily successful in enacting it, especially if they had an opposition Congress.
Hopefully. And one final disclaimer here. This is obviously another opinion video. Okay, that out of the way. Folks, let's do this. Number 10, John P. Hale. Okay. I've talked about Hale before in my Best 10 Senators video, but here's a recap. He was a senator from New Hampshire who was one of the leading abolitionist voices in Congress before it was cool, helping start the Free Soil Party and being nominated as their presidential candidate in 1852.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting election because... let's bring that up again.
Being nominated as their presidential.
So 1852, what do you have? You've got two generals from the Mexican War, and Franklin Pierce and Winfield Scott. Scott, of course, has no sense of any kind of political experience other than he's a career military guy. Pierce has got more. But this is a very consequential election. And I think I would have to agree with Matt on this one. I think John Hale would have been a much superior candidate to Franklin Pierce or Winfield Scott in that election. Keep in mind, though, that sitting senators rarely get elected president. Barack Obama was a sitting senator. I think Warren Harding was. Very few times, John F. Kennedy, very few times in history has someone been elected directly from the Senate to the White House.
Candidate in 1852. Hale and the Free Soil Party strongly opposed the expansion of slavery out west. And of course, that meant that they were not on board with the Compromise of 1850.
Oh my gosh. Matt, you're such a nerd, and I love it because I am too. Yeah, but here's the thing. Opposition to expansion of slavery by the new Republican Party, which ran its first candidate in 1956, is the main catalyst for secession. So would that have moved the timeline up of the Civil War?
Compromise of 1850. In particular, Hale went hard against the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that slaves had to be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state, and it even made the federal government responsible for helping to return escaped slaves.
So much for states' rights, eh, South?
Hale called for its repeal and also called for lower tariffs, lower postal rates, more government money for infrastructure improvements, and more worker rights.
Solid.
Yeah, Hale got his butt kicked in the election of 1852, but every time I learn more about him, I am impressed by his courage and passion fighting for justice, whether others were alongside him or not.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. He had no chance to win, but I agree with that pick. I would have voted for Hale in that election.
Number 9, Samuel Tilden.
Not sure I agree with this
Tilden
one.
and his running mate, Thomas Hendricks, famously got screwed over in the presidential election of 1876. He is the only person in American history to win a majority, not just the plurality, of the popular vote, but still lose the election. He lost the Electoral College by just a single vote.
So what he's pointing out there is that there have been other times in history where a candidate has gotten the most popular votes but didn't win. But more than 50% of the popular vote, Tilden sits alone in that one. Because, many times we've elected presidents who got less than 50%, and now anymore, you very rarely will see a person win the White House with over 50% of the vote. I mean, Bill Clinton got in the low 40s and won because you had Ross Perot in that election. Lincoln got around 40%.
Many of his supporters were obviously upset and cried #StopTheSteal, but after the election, Tilden urged his supporters to remain calm and to not get violent. He accepted defeat with grace when most people who might be in his place would not. But while many remember Tilden simply as the dude who narrowly lost the election of 1876, he also was a decent human being. A man of integrity who always fought for the underdog. He made a career of fighting corruption and special interests in government and in New York politics.
And that's an interesting thing to point out there, because this is that time in history where one of the major battles being fought at the federal government level is against corruption, against what they call the spoils system, which is you win the election and now all of your cronies get jobs in the federal government, the spoils of war, so to speak. And in New York is where this corruption is the strongest, because you've got the whole Tammany Hall thing, and you've got the Port of New York, which is the main source of revenue for the federal government. And that position was a lucrative one for whoever got it.
When he ran for president, he ran as basically a bourbon Democrat or classical liberal, calling for lower tariffs, civil service reform, but also the conservation of public land.
And these are things that are all going to be instituted by other presidents in the coming years, the likes of Garfield and Chester Arthur and others. So, yeah, a solid platform. I wonder if he'll say anything about Reconstruction.
Tilden could have run for president again in 1880 and 1884, as many of his passionate supporters wanted him to, and he probably would have won, honestly, but he refused to run again, mostly due to his declining health.
So he didn't say anything about Reconstruction. A lot of people point to the Rutherford Hayes, who won that election, and the deal that Rutherford Hayes made to withdraw federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. But the bottom line is Reconstruction was over either way, because if Tilden had won, he would have also withdrawn the federal troops from the South and ended Reconstruction. Most of his support was in the South. So it didn't matter who won that election. The outcome would have been the same, regrettably, when it comes to Reconstruction.
Number 8, Daniel Webster. I've also talked about Webster before in my best 10 senators video, but
I think pretty much any list of the top senators, the most influential senators all time, is going to definitely include Daniel Webster.
Here's another recap. Webster never had any aspirations to be president. It was always just other people campaigning for him to be president, and he kind of just went along with it. He was just like, okay, well, I'd rather be in the Senate, but you do you. And as senator, he certainly was amazing, considered by most historians as one of the best ever, and also served as Secretary of State under 2 different administrations and spent some time in the House of Representatives.
So he mentioned Secretary of State. The time was that Secretary of State was the primary jumping off point for becoming president. So many of our early presidents served as Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson was the very first Secretary of State. Monroe, Madison, John Quincy Adams, James Buchanan, and there were others, but they were all Secretaries of State.
Not only was he influential in getting major legislation passed in Congress, he was also an intelligent dude. I said it before and I'll say it again. He knew the Constitution better than any other member of Congress in American history. Webster was also charismatic, an incredible speaker, and had a passion for justice. Now, many forget that he ran for president. Really, the Whig Party ran him as one of 4 candidates in that weird presidential election of 1836. They mostly ran on decreasing the power of the presidency, but also for bringing back a national bank and expanding major infrastructure projects. Yeah, the Whig Party was...
Yeah, infrastructure was a pretty common platform to run on in the early part of the country's history. John Quincy Adams, it was kind of the cornerstone of his platform when he ran.
For tariffs, and you all know that I generally don't like tariffs, but Webster was at least pragmatic about them. Number 7. William Wirt. Wirt was the longest-serving United States Attorney General in history and was extremely devoted to his profession. He knew the Constitution better than most and easily won a ton of court cases. Most famously, the Supreme Court cases McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden, and Wooster v. Georgia. Of course, back in 1807, the president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, asked Wirt to be the prosecutor in Aaron Burr's trial for treason, and Wirt lost the case, but became famous.
And think about that. That's just a couple years after Aaron Burr was vice president of the United States. And we all forget he also murdered Alexander Hamilton, but, treason.
Famous for his eloquent and witty speeches. He was known for his calm and collected demeanor and high intelligence. Jump ahead to the presidential election of 1832, and Wirt became the candidate for the newly formed Anti-Masonic Party, the country's first significant third party. Its party's creators were afraid of a group known as the Freemasons, thinking they were a powerful secret society attempting to steer the country in the wrong direction. The Anti-Masonic Party nominated Wirt, even though Wirt used to be a Freemason himself, and even though he really did not want to run for president. In fact, the historian William Preston Vaughan later wrote, quote, "Wirt was possibly the most reluctant and most unwilling presidential candidate ever nominated by an American party."
Yeah, it's amazing how many times in history there have been people who have said, no, I don't want to do this, and people have dragged them kicking and screaming into candidacy. Another example of a guy who chose not to run and then they listened to it and who certainly could have been president was William Tecumseh Sherman. He told them, he said, if you nominate me, I won't run, and if I am elected, I won't serve. And they said, okay, then they nominated someone else. But he absolutely probably, I can't say absolutely probably, he almost certainly would have won had he been willing to run.
Unquote. So yeah, while he personally didn't campaign or publicly speak out against the Freemasons, I appreciate his supporters campaigning against them and the elites. They also campaigned for massive infrastructure improvements, more government transparency, and an end to slavery. Even though Wirt and his running mate Amos Ellmaker, there he is, the OH, or original hipster. Anyway, even though both lost...
Just gotta pause here because I just got a text from Matt Beat. I texted him before I started this video and said, hey, is today the day? As I'm recording this, he is 50 subs away from 1 million, which means by the time this video goes live, I think he'll probably be there already. So congratulations, Matt, on 1 million. Richly deserved. So proud of you, man.
Lost the 1832 election. They became the first third-party presidential ticket to win a state. Which state? Why, Vermont, of course. Good job, Vermont. Number 6.
Wendell Willkie.
Willkie ran against Franklin Roosevelt in the election of 1940.
So this is interesting because this would mean then that Willkie would have been president during World War II.
He actually used to be a Democrat, but changed his political party affiliation to Republican after getting frustrated with how inefficient some of Roosevelt's New Deal programs were. Willkie had integrity and vision. He was a problem solver who was above party politics. When he was a lawyer in Ohio, he was an activist who successfully fought against the influence of the Ku Klux Klan.
People forget the Klan has this revival in like the years following you-know-who's presidency. There were huge Klan rallies here in Northeast Ohio in the 1920s. And they had moved on from just being kind of an anti-African American group to anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. And I believe the big rally that happened in Niles, Ohio, near where I live, had to do with kind of anti-Italian Catholic immigrants.
Became famous across the country in 1933 as CEO of the Commonwealth and Southern Corporation, which provided electrical power to customers in many southern states. The Roosevelt administration threatened Wilkie's company by its plans to establish the Tennessee Valley Authority. Wilkie actually supported many New Deal reforms, like a minimum wage and a limit on workers' hours, unemployment insurance, and collective bargaining. However,
So it's interesting to think, if he had been elected as a Republican, how the Republican Party might have gone in a different direction. You know, we have what are called party systems. They're the times when the parties shift. The parties are constantly changing. I know everybody likes to talk about a party swap, like the party switch that happened. There's no such thing in the strictest sense of the term, because the parties are always moving. The Republican and Democratic parties of today are not the Republican and Democratic parties of 20 years ago. They're certainly not the ones from 60 years ago, and those ones weren't the ones from 60 years before that. So they're constantly changing. So when you get someone who is successful, they can take the party in a different direction. Look at where the Republican Party has gone and is still kind of experiencing almost like a civil war since Donald Trump came to leadership there. If Wilkie had won, how different might the parties look today?
Didn't think the, quote, top-down approach of the federal government controlling utilities would go so well. So yeah, by 1940, Wilkie was now a Republican and a dark horse candidate against Roosevelt as he ran for an unprecedented third term. Wilkie was a bit of a wild card as a political outsider who ran under the platform of intervening in World War II, but not in a way that would get Americans killed and more economic freedom.
Well, I mean, FDR was doing that, intervening in World War II, but not in a way that got too many Americans killed.
He lost the election of 1940 with grace. In fact, he later worked with Franklin Roosevelt and even went before Congress to support Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program. More proof that he was above party politics.
That's a great point. I wish we had more of that. You know, some people are at the place where no matter what the other side says, if they say it, you oppose it, even though it might be something that's great for the country and that you might otherwise have agreed with it. And if your own guy had proposed it, you would support it. But because it came from the other guy, you oppose it. And we've got to get away from that. We have to be able to recognize when the other side does something beneficial to the country and does something right, and be willing to say so without automatically opposing it just because of where it came from.
Before I get into my top 5, please leave an angry comment below. Oh, and this video is once again sponsored by Ground News. So we
they just
all
reached
know
out to
the
me
news
about sponsorship.
Sucks, right? I mean, traditional media is incentivized to generate as much clicks as possible by making as much divisive content as possible. And don't even get me started about social media. It's making matters even worse by pushing people further into their tribal bubbles.
100%.
Ground News is one of the few companies out there working to solve this problem. It's a new startup working on rebuilding that shared sense of reality we all used to have, putting readers back in the driver's seat and giving people more control over the news they read. Founded by a former NASA engineer, Ground News is an apolitical news comparison platform that instantly shows multiple perspectives on controversial issues. It features more than 50,000 news outlets from across the world and political spectrum. Personally, my favorite thing about Ground News is the blind spot feature. It basically shows you all the news that's not being covered by one end of the political spectrum. So it kind of forces you out of your bubble to see, oh, this is what the other guys are paying attention to, and maybe I should pay attention to it as well. Ground News is simply what I want the future of news to look like. Neutral and just there to keep you informed. Try it out by clicking the link in the description of this video. You can try the Ground News app out for free. All right, where were we? Not the White House, am I right? Number 5.
Ross Perot.
Perot was the first presidential candidate I watched on TV.
First presidential candidate I ever voted for. I was actually, so 1992, I was a sophomore in high school. He ran in 92 and 96. I was a sophomore in high school in 92. And we did a school-wide debate, and they put together debate teams, and almost all of the people on the debate teams were seniors. I was one of the few sophomores that ended up on one of these debate teams, and I was on the Perot debate team. You had one for, let's see, this is 92. So you had one for Bush, one for, who was running in that? No, that was Bill Clinton. So it was one for Bush, one for Bill Clinton, and one for Ross Perot. And I was on the Perot debate team. And actually, once we presented the debate, they had an election in our school, and Ross Perot won in our school. So pretty proud of that.
As a kid, and remember life.
So I didn't vote in 92, obviously, because I was a sophomore. I voted for him in 96.
No third-party candidate has done as well in a presidential election in my entire life as Perot. I mean, he got nearly 19% of the popular vote in the 1992 presidential election.
And he probably would have gotten a lot more, but he actually dropped out of the race and then joined back in. And he would buy, like, he was a billionaire, and so he would buy these spots on TV. And he'd get on there with these charts and start talking like now we're going to look under the hood of this car and see what the problem is, and he had a very particular way of talking, and I loved it. I wish we had other options besides the same two parties all the time.
Despite running as a complete outsider to D.C. politics. Sure, he essentially bought his way in there, as he was a billionaire who spent tens of millions of dollars of his own cash to purchase half-hour and hour-long infomercials that aired during prime time on major TV networks, often using charts to illustrate his ideas for the economy. And heck yeah, he was a successful businessman who knew a thing or two or three or four about the economy, being the founder and CEO of Electronic Data Systems and Perot Systems, two information technology companies that helped him make his billions. He was another problem solver who thought outside the box and had fresh ideas. He was a self-made man who served in the Navy. He was not an ideologue, just pragmatic. His campaign focused on expanding democracy through this new thing at the time called the internet, balancing the budget, and fighting the influence of lobbyists.
Good stuff.
He was critical of supply-side economics. Okay, so he was also for protectionism and the war on drugs, but nobody's perfect. Plus, I kind of get why he leaned toward protectionism.
We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. There will be a giant sucking sound going south. So if the people send me to Washington, the first thing I'll do is study that 2,000-page agreement and make sure it's a two-way street.
Besides, he was so likable and witty, and most importantly, he cared. It was about his ideas, not him. It was pretty clear that he was mostly running to help the country.
I could agree with that one.
Number 4, William Jennings Bryan.
This guy ran for president so many freaking times.
Brian ran as the official candidate for the Democratic Party for 3 different presidential elections. The election of 1896, election of 1900, and election of 1908. Along with the legendary Henry Clay, Bryan is the only person to never win a presidential election despite receiving electoral votes in 3 different elections held after the 12th Amendment passed. In fact, when Bryan ran that 3rd time, the supporters of his opponent, William Howard Taft, mocked him, saying, quote, "Vote for Taft now, you can vote for Bryan anytime."
Bryan, no matter how he looks, he was actually pretty young the first time he ran. He was a young guy, very outspoken about his Christian faith. In modern times, he would be kind of considered part of that Christian right. Of course, different times.
But it's understandable why he ran 3 times. He was extremely popular. But let's first just get this out of the way. Later in his life, we saw more wacky views for him as seen in the Scopes trial as he argued against evolution. But other than that, he was a very likable person.
wasn't a wacky view for him, though. I think that was consistently who he was even when he ran for president. I'm not sure that was a later thing. It's just that the Scopes monkey trial came about later on. And Clarence Darrow, who was the lawyer on the other side, is actually from Trumbull County, Ohio, which is where I was born and raised.
Person. Bryan is one of the best examples we have in American history of a populist candidate.
Yeah.
One who actively sought to represent the interests of ordinary people.
And actually that word populism comes from a Roman word, which was used to describe someone who kind of was going along with what the people wanted.
Former U.S. Representative from Nebraska, he was passionate, charismatic, and just plain exciting, especially when he ran for president the first time. At just 36 years old, he would have been the youngest president ever elected. That was also the election where he gave his dramatic Cross of Gold speech, which was apparently so good that after he was done, some delegates carried him out on their shoulders out of the national convention as if he was the quarterback who had just scored the winning touchdown. Each time he ran for president, he ran for the underdog, particularly for the farmers who were struggling across the country. He called out monopolies and imperialism. Though he never became president, he had a huge influence on the direction of the country.
It's interesting him calling out imperialism. Obviously, that's a time when McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt are expanding, our reach into the Pacific, acquiring Hawaii and the Philippines and the Spanish-American War. That's all about imperialism.
Oh, snap. I got another populist for you, and this one is from Nebraska's neighbor to the east, Iowa. Number 3, James B. Weaver. Before William Jennings Bryan, there was James Weaver, the OP, or original populist. Man, Weaver was a man of his time and had old-fashioned views about Native Americans, but I like Weaver for his fighting.
But again, that was kind of the time period, right? I think most candidates at that time did.
Against the elites and for ordinary Americans. While he was a presidential candidate or possible presidential candidate multiple times, his best chance at the presidency was in the presidential election of 1892, in which he ran with James G. Field, and they won 8.5% of the popular votes and 22 electoral votes. That was with the newly formed Populist Party, whose platform included the free and unlimited coinage of silver to create inflation, more money being loaned out to ordinary folks, national ownership of all public utilities, a progressive income tax, the popular election of U.S. senators, the expansion of direct democracy.
Yeah. He lost my vote with all that stuff. No.
And making it illegal for foreigners to own land in the United States.
All right, maybe that one.
I only recently learned more about Weaver, and most Americans know nothing about him at all.
Yeah, I don't think I could vote for him.
The more I learn, the more I'm impressed about him. Weaver was a Civil War hero with integrity and strong morals.
Was he from Pennsylvania in the Civil War? No, he was actually born in Ohio. He's from Dayton, Ohio. Okay. So he probably served it looks like they lived in Michigan. And then he went out. Where did he go? He did come back to Ohio. So he served where? The 2nd Iowa. All right. So he served from Iowa. And Iowa was heavily involved in battles like Shiloh, Fort Donelson. There's that whole area right in front of the Hornet's Nest where Iowans took massive casualties during that battle. Very cool.
Was associated with 4 political parties and was always about principles over partisanship. He could have earned much more money practicing law, but instead left it to reform the government. Simply put, he was just a good person. Number 2, Robert La Fallet. Wait a second, Fighting Bob isn't number 1?
Look at that hair, man. Look at that hair. My man is like, he's Beavis. He really looks like Beavis.
What the heck? Okay, longtime viewers already know that Robert La Fallet is pretty much my favorite politician in American history. He's my favorite senator. He was my favorite governor, maybe number 2 now. But regardless, I do think his best work was in Congress and in Wisconsin state government. Plus, You're gonna love my #1 candidate, I guarantee it. Anyway, yeah, let's recap yet again here. He was the leading progressive voice in Congress for almost 20 years. He fought tariffs. He fought for labor unions. He fought against giant corporations that were trying to get out of paying taxes, trying to exploit workers, and trying to not be regulated. He fought monopolies. He fought for social welfare. He fought against cronyism. He fought to expand democracy. He fought to end imperialism. He fought to end child labor. He fought to expand civil liberties. Oh, did I tell you his nickname was Fighting Bob?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were in favor of those things during the progressive era, but I get why he likes him.
His nickname was Fighting Bob. And he would have made a fine president when he ran in the election of 1924, and I say that even as a big fan of Coolidge. #1, John
Anderson?
No, not that John Anderson.
I was going to say.
Yes. That John Anderson. John B. Anderson. The powerful candidate with the boring name. I'm telling you, this guy is underrated in American history. He ran as an independent against incumbent Jimmy Carter and challenger Ronald Reagan in the presidential election of 1980. Before that, he was a Republican representing Illinois' 16th congressional district for 20 years. Before that, he was a lawyer, why of course, and before that, he served in the Army during World War II.
So we talked earlier about shifts in the demographics of a party and shifts in kind of the platforms of the party. And Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 obviously is a shift to the right for the Republicans. There had been shifts to the right going back to Goldwater in the 60s, but your Republican presidents in that time, Nixon and Ford, are much more moderate voices. Same with the previous Republican president in Eisenhower. So Reagan is your first real conservative Republican elected in the latest party system. So Anderson's probably a pushback against that, or an alternative to that.
In Congress, he constantly pushed for legislation that increased equality and went above party politics. President Gerald Ford once said about him, quote, "He's the smartest guy in Congress, but he insists on voting his conscience instead of party." After losing in the Republican primaries, he decided to run for president anyway, starting his own political party called the National Unity Party. He basically just took all the best ideas from both the Republican and Democratic Party. His big proposal while running wasn't really that exciting though, but I think it's important. He wanted to cut Social Security taxes, but raise the gas tax in order to reduce dependence on cars and help the environment. But
it probably wasn't a really popular thing to do coming out of the 70s, where there was serious issues with gas supply already.
It wasn't just gas. He supported tax credits for businesses to increase American productivity, but not tax cuts for the super wealthy like his opponent Reagan. He opposed the military draft and supported the Equal Rights Amendment. He actually released a 317-page comprehensive platform listing out all his pragmatic plans. It was full of nuance and honestly was probably way too rational for Washington, D.C.
I was going to say, people aren't going to sit down and read 300 and some pages. The unfortunate reality, and I commend him for that, the unfortunate reality is that our elections have been reduced to sound bites and what you can sell to somebody in 30 seconds.
Even though he polled as high as 26% at one point during his campaign,
Impressive.
Anderson sadly ended up only getting about 6.6% of the popular vote. And
unfortunately, what happens is, early on in the polling, people are going to support the candidate they support. But as you get closer to the election, a lot of people are going to be thinking more about who can win in their minds, not who they think would be the best candidate. And that's why, unfortunately, we never really get viable third candidates.
No electoral votes. After the election, he went back to being a lawyer and helped create one of my favorite nonprofit organizations in the country, Fair Vote, which calls for proportional representation in American elections and instant runoff voting. Today, hardly anyone knows that John B. Anderson existed. Just searching for him on YouTube gets videos with barely any views. But dang it, Americans should know about this man. He was was an honest and decent man who was a true reformer. If more politicians in D.C. were like him today, perhaps most of us wouldn't be as cynical as we generally are about D.C. today. So that's it, my top 10 failed presidential candidates. I think my country would be better off if they had all won the presidency.
All right, so congratulations, Matt, on 1 million subscribers. Super proud of you, man. Glad to call you a friend. Excited for the future of your channel. Everybody join me. Head over to Matt's channel, to Mr. Beat, and just tell him congratulations. Get on one of his latest videos and watch it, and tell him congratulations on 1 million subscribers. Couldn't happen to a better guy. Thanks for watching, and we will see you again soon.